communities, it's labor unions, it's small businesses, and really what a maximum employment and price stability and growth mean to them. And I have to say, if you listen to one of these things and sit through it, it's quite striking. It really does. I think it sheds a different kind of light than we might ordinarily get just from all of the economics that we study. So we take all that on board, and now we're going through a series of board meetings at which we're looking at things like makeup strategies for inflation and our toolkit and how we communicate, and we're going through those things one by one. I think we're making great progress, and I'm hopeful that we will. I think the exercise itself is a big win and a big gain for transparency and process, but I'm hopeful, and I believe we'll be able to come out with some innovations which will put us in a better place to serve the public. And I'm also happy to see other central banks around the world are kind of picking up on the idea and doing it. So
great. So you mentioned the toolkit, and certainly the toolkit over the last decade has expanded quite considerably for not just the Fed but other central banks. And as you consider the prospect of if we do see a full business cycle, what tools in that toolkit are you interested in using again? And then what tools do you not have in that toolkit that you hope to have?
As this audience will know well, the tools that we did use in the last financial crisis, of course, were rates, the federal funds rate, which we cut close to zero, effectively to zero. And then we also used fairly aggressively forward guidance, indicating that to the market, and this was at a time when the market was predicting lift-off and rate increases that were higher than the committee thought were appropriate, committed sort of semi-commitments to hold rates low for a long time. So that worked. And also large-scale asset purchases of longer-term securities, so which are a way of lowering long-term interest rates to support economic activity. So those are, I guess we need to stop calling them unconventional tools at some point, but those are the two new tools that we used during the financial crisis. I'm sure that we would use them again as needed and as appropriate. We don't see that now. We looked carefully at negative interest rates. I don't think that's something, I know it's something we didn't see as an ideal tool in our institutional context, and I think different central banks around the world did different things, and we can observe how those things work. But I don't think we regard that as a first-order tool or something we'd be likely to use. There are other things that we need to look at, and I would say yield curve control, sort of short-term yield curve control, is something worth looking at. It's not at all something we haven't looked at it, but it will be something that we look at when the time comes. And the last thing I'll say is I think our toolkit, we'll use it aggressively to the extent we need to to achieve our mandate.
So one of the questions I got from someone today who knew I was going to be asking you questions was, is there an unintended consequence of, in a sort of reasonable growth, low unemployment, near the target rate, inflation rate, is there an unintended consequence of easing into that environment? Does it actually signal a risk-off environment to participants or consumers, et cetera, and does it actually almost become a self-fulfilling prophecy?
I don't think we see that in the data. I mean, in theory, that's possible. I don't think we see it in the data. I do look at this as akin to the two instances in the 1990s when the Fed cut and then cut again and then cut a third time. In those cases, that happened to be the right thing, that they thought that was the right thing to do. So provided some support for the economy, and the economy took that accommodation on board and gathered steam again, and the expansion continued. So that's the spirit in which we're doing this. I don't see any evidence that monetary policy is reducing or business confidence, which seems to be focused more on other issues.
One of the dynamics over the years, especially following the GFC, was policy coordination amongst the global central banks, the BOJ, the ECB, the Bank of England, the Fed, even to some extent the PBOC. And what are your thoughts on policy coordination going forward? What systems are in place?
In a crisis situation, there needs to be, obviously, a lot of deep knowledge about what's going on in economies around the world and coordination where it's appropriate. So I think of the swap lines, the dollar swap lines were clearly a key in keeping dollar funding markets working. In peacetime, in times like today where we're not in crisis, we do keep in very close touch with central banks around the world, and I think that's a very healthy thing. Coordination, the first step is transparency, and we all try to be very transparent so that our moves are well understood. Coordination, I think, really arises in the state of crisis, and so we don't actively coordinate now, but we try to explain ourselves to the public and hence to each other.
All right. One of the negative of having an electronic device that people can upvote questions is that there's a question that's getting upvoted about how monetary policy and climate change inform one another. Maybe I'll read the question directly, but any thoughts on that?
Sure. So climate change is a very important issue in my way of thinking for countries and governments to deal with around the world. As I said, it's an absolute first-order issue as far as I'm concerned. Less obvious is that it's a first-order business for central banks. I think the main responsibility for climate change now, dealing with climate change, resides with legislatures and particular agencies that are focused on the economy. However, I think we are learning that financial markets and financial institutions are important, transmission into the economy of policies of various sorts. And central banks around the world are starting to think more about how and whether central banks should play a direct role in climate change. I'd say we're not there yet. We're not in a place where I think we would conduct monetary policy in order to deal with climate change type issues. But there's a lot of forward thinking and analysis going on. Of course, in bank supervision, we already supervise financial institutions in areas that are subject to severe weather, which is possibly related to climate change. We already require them to have plans to deal with severe weather redundancies and resilience to what can happen in a, for example, a hurricane. So in that sense, it's already kind of endogenous to our supervision work, but I think it's an important work, and we're going to be following carefully developments around the world on that.
So a lot of questions about the repo market, as you're probably not surprised to hear. And essentially, the question that is percolating through this room and the financial markets is, what is the repo market telling us? Why are the banks in what we're seeing in terms of the spikes in the repo markets, the need to do some intervention from the Federal Reserve? And is the Fed almost coming back into QE, or would you describe this intervention as something different?
Let's start there. This is not QE. In no sense is this QE. This is nothing like it all. This is I'll come back to that point, but I really wanted to make sure.
Yes, I
didn't want to forget to say that.
Right.
So if you go back, the quantity of reserves in the banking system peaked at about 2.8 trillion at the end of 2014 when we finished doing quantitative easing. And then due to increases in other reserves and also just to the increases in non-reserve liabilities really declined. While we held the balance sheet constant, reserves were actually shrinking down to, I guess, about 2.4 trillion when under Chair Yellen, we began normalizing, actually shrinking the balance sheet, letting assets run off very, very gradually. So that went on. And then in March of this year, we tapered that. And in, I guess, July of this year, we stopped. And I think through all of that, we were moving quite gradually, and we were carefully talking to the banks and doing surveys and trying to assess what would be their lowest comfortable level of reserves, add all that up, and then put a big buffer on top of it. And I think doing that work, checking it twice, led us to, and also watching the markets, led us to think that we were still probably away from a minimum level of reserves. And let me define what that is. We've committed to a system of ample reserves, and that means that we'll be able to conduct monetary policy, keep the federal funds rate in its range without resorting to open market operations all the time. So I think it very much looked like we were still a bit perhaps above that until September, when we found that we probably weren't.
Yeah.
And so we found that out, and so there are a number of explanations. It can be that reserves are just kind of less flexible. The quantity of reserves are less fluid, less flexible in the markets than we had anticipated. In any case, there are a number of possible explanations, and I think a plan to get us to our goal is going to need to take all of those on board over time. So we're working on just such a plan, and as I mentioned, we'll announce it soon when it's ready. It's not ready yet, but we're very much making great progress on that. And the idea will be to add enough reserves back in so that reserves will, of course, move up and down during the course of the year, and they'll also go up over time as the balance sheet expands. But reserves move around quite a bit during the course of a year. They have to be at a level so that their lowest level during the year will not be below the level that's needed to allow us to operate in an ample reserve regime. And we think that level might be at or maybe a bit above where we were in early September of this year. We think that. All of this is, though, uncertain. We're still learning. So we'll be adding reserves back in when we announce our plan to get back to something like that level. Of course, we'll continue to use open market operations to the extent we need to for as long as we need to. The main thing is this is very important for the financial markets, and we will do what we have to do to secure the transmission of monetary policy. It doesn't actually, as long as we do that, it actually doesn't have much implications for the economy, for financial conditions, or for the people we serve.
Wonderful. Great.
But not QE. Did I mention that?
Not QE. You did mention that.
All right.
You did mention that. So I will ask you the same question I asked you a year ago, which is your thoughts on the yield curve. So now we were starting to see the curve flatten a year ago. Today it is an inverted curve. And what are your thoughts at this point on what the yield curve is telling us?
You know, so the yield curve is one of a large number of financial conditions that we actively monitor. It's not, there is no single financial condition that really dominates all the others, but that's one that we certainly do monitor. And I guess we know why, we kind of know why what short rates are doing. Short rates are really reflecting what they think the Fed's going to do. Really the question is what are longer rates saying? And they're saying a lot of different things. There's a term premium there, which is about risk on, risk off, that moves up and down in different states of sentiment, market sentiment. There's also some sort of an assessment, though, in there about what the neutral rate is in the longer run. And so we look carefully at that and try to see if we think policy is above the market's estimate of the neutral rate, then policy is tight. And so we have to sort of assess that. But, you know, so when the curve is inverted, you know, we focus very carefully on that. And it's not something that you need to deal with immediately, but it is something that it wouldn't be comfortable to be in that state of affairs for an extended period of time, of course. But again, it's one of many conditions. I hope that's what I said last year, by the way.
I think so. I think so. All right. So the Fed has consistently characterized inflation as too low. Given that core CPI is at the highest level since 2008, and the Fed's preferred measure, core PCE, the 6-month annualized rate is above 2%, do you anticipate changing your assessment of inflation?
I would like to change my assessment of inflation. I would like to see it move symmetrically around 2%. And in PCE and core PCE terms, it still hasn't done that. We've seen take core PCE, which is a better indicator of future inflation than regular PCE, although regular PCE is, of course, our goal. So you take core inflation, it's moved up and just kind of touched 2% and then moved back down to well below 2% in the first quarter of this year. It's now moving back up. I guess the real question is, why do we care? It's just, it's essentially, it appears to be centered a few tenths below 2%. And the reason we care is not that 2 or 3 tenths of inflation really makes a big difference. The issue is more the broader context. We want inflation expectations to be centered right at 2%, and we really want to hammer that point and make sure that they are. Because we look around the world and we see disinflationary forces in Japan and Western Europe, where you see inflation moving down, expectations move down, inflation moves down, and it's been very, very hard for economies to get off that road once they're on it. And so we don't want to get on that road. We don't think we're going to be exempt to these disinflationary pressures over time. We've got an aging population, as others do, and I think some of the same characteristics to our economy. So for that reason, we want to keep inflation at 2%. And it's not easy to explain that to the general public who don't really care whether inflation is 1.7 or 2%. But in our case, we think to serve them better, we need to anchor inflation at 2% so that it doesn't begin that inexorable slide down.
So when you come in to the office every day, or as you travel through your day-to-day life, I am curious what your dashboard looks like. What are you looking at on your dashboard to give you an indication of where your ship is or your plane is heading? So are you looking at, you mentioned industrial production, you mentioned productivity, inflation. Are there external factors like rest of world growth indicators? What are the things that are your touchstones that are most important on your dashboard?
You know, it's there's a lot of things on the dashboard, I would say. I try to do a deep dive on the economy mostly every weekend. I'll spend a whole day reading everything that I haven't been able to read during the week about what's going on in the U.S. economy, and that means reading the data releases and the analysis of the data releases by many of you here in this room, and also around the world, also globally, following data and following markets and that kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing you can do on a long, quiet day when you don't have meetings all day long. So that's a big part of it. I also think right now the broader sort of geopolitical risks are important right now, and you have to be watching those carefully and trying to assess the implication of those. I watch markets very carefully. I have a screen in my office where I don't sit there watching it all day, but you check in several times a day to look at what's happening in all the various markets that we all probably follow. So it's essentially, I look at everything in a way, and as I imagine many of us do.
So the Fed's role is not a social welfare role, but many would argue that the fall in the unemployment rate, the re-engagement of many people within the labor market who are out on the edges, that what we're seeing over the last couple of years has been extremely positive for the U.S. economy and the U.S. population. Is that something that is taken into consideration, that if we can continue to run the economy a little bit hot, that it could be quite a positive?
I would say that I see that aspect of the current situation as a very positive one. I guess I would question the concept of running the economy hot. I think we've learned that the unemployment rate can just be lower than we anticipated, even than 5 or 6 or 10 years ago. It's significantly lower, and yet we don't see wages rising in a way that is out of keeping with productivity and inflation. And we do see businesses saying that they see workers as scarce. We see workers saying that they believe jobs are plentiful. Those are good things. We see prime age labor force participation going up. We talk to people in those low and moderate income communities at the Fed Listens events, and they say that this is the best economy they've seen in their lifetimes. So I would say I put a very high priority on wanting to continue that. I really do. But I guess I do a little bit balk at the idea that we're running the economy hot. This feels very sustainable. There's no aspect of the economy that is just booming. It's you've got a solid consumer sector where wages are going up, but they're going up right about at the level of productivity plus inflation. Job creation is healthy. There's no one sector that is, that like a housing bubble. There's nothing like that. There's no financial bubble. So it's a fairly sustainable economy. There are concerns around, business investment and manufacturing and trade, of course. But I would say we don't get to see the 11th year of an expansion very often. And there's a lot to like about it, particularly for people at the lower end of the wage scale who are getting now the highest increases. And it would be great to see it continue.
Right. So one of the, if we look at the markets, we see that the purchasing of insurance to hedge inflation risk is at all-time lows or extremely benign. But at the same time, we're in the midst of starting to increase tariffs on China. We're seeing several rounds that are going to come through. As that starts to show up in the CPI prints, et cetera, how does the Fed respond to those?
I think the basic approach to that for me would be that an increase in tariffs is, if it flows through to the consumer, is perhaps a one-time increase in prices, which is a different thing from inflation. As long as one-time increases in prices don't carry through into inflation expectations, then you don't actually have an increase in inflation. So now it's clear that if you look back at the history of the 70s with the oil crisis, some of those shocks can affect, if they're sustained and repeated, they actually can get into people's inflation expectations. We're a long way from that, though. If you look around the world, disinflationary pressures everywhere you look in advanced economies. It feels like the problem of this era is to keep inflation from moving down and try to keep it at 2%. Now, of course, if that changes, then we'll know it pretty quickly and we'll know what to do.
Great. Well, Chair Powell, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Whoa, breaking news, folks. From that speech and the Q&A, we have gotten multiple headlines that are hitting the tape and moving the markets right now. Let's start with what Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell just insisted during the question and answer session at the National Association for Business Economics annual meeting. He said that what he announced in his preamble speech before that crowd, that he would restart the Treasury purchases known during the financial crisis as QE, or stimulative quantitative easing, are not QE. And I quote Chairman Powell, "In no sense is this QE." Okay, I'm telling you, the market saw that as QE when he first announced it, but we're still down about 157 points. But the question is, did he revive the markets when he declared during the speech that the Fed is contemplating regrowing the balance sheet by purchasing Treasury bills? Well, the markets, which have been likened to a big voting machine, voted almost immediately that, yeah, it sure looks and sounds like QE. And almost immediately, we had gone from a triple-digit loss to a double-digit loss on the Dow. Right now, we are up off the floor. We had been down more than 300 points earlier today and bathed in red for the open, and on that tit-for-tat posturing on the U.S.-China trade war, as both sides meet for the second straight day. But again, now that we're down just about 156 points on the Dow, you can see that the markets are absorbing what Jay Powell said as an indication that he may begin to reflate the balance sheet, which is something that they did during the financial crisis to stabilize and stimulate the economy. Let me get to our floor show, and I want to let our guys know, our floor show traders, this is also hitting the tape. And part of the reason that we went from down about 90 points at the low of the session, at the high of the session rather, a loss of 90 points, that back down to what we see right now, is that it hit the tape that the United States is going to impose some visa, I guess, what would you call it? Some visa restrictions. The State Department said it will impose visa restrictions on Chinese government and Communist Party officials. Yeah, so suddenly the tensions of trade are hitting everything, but we've also got the Fed here. I want to start with Sarge. What do you see? How do you interpret what Jay Powell just said, that we're going to regrow the balance sheet, but it's not QE?
This is actually what I'm speaking of in many of my recent interviews. I've been calling it POMO because I knew they didn't want to call it quantitative easing. So I've been referring to it as permanent open market operations. They obviously need to grow the balance sheet as if just to handle the overnight money markets. But they probably need to grow the balance sheet a little bit just for the economy's sake as well. I do like that he mentioned a lower trajectory for the Fed funds rate. We all know I've been a proponent of that of late. I do think we need to repair the yield curve. He seemed to admit that he doesn't really have a handle on how loose labor markets are or how tight they are, which I thought was quite honest. We know that productivity has slowed. We know the ISM, the employment part of both ISM reports was kind of weak. We saw the small business report this morning, which was weak, especially for future employment. So there are questions there. I don't like that he mentioned data dependency as reliable as the way the Fed has always operated, because I don't like that. I think they need to be ahead of the curve a little bit. I think we have to watch tomorrow's Thursday's CPI, to be honest with you. The core CPI has been running a little bit hot. PPI was cold this morning. If CPI follows suit, this guy has smooth sailing to do what needs to be done.
Okay, Phil Flynn, you need to cut through this and tell me, am I crazy, or did Jay Powell just announce a new stimulative version of quantitative easing?
I don't think he did, to be honest with you. I think it's a little hyperbole, even though the markets initially took it as that. Mm-hmm. I mean, we saw the gold rally, which of course would be in QE. But interestingly enough, normally when you get a shot of stimulus from the Federal Reserve, you would expect the stock market to go up, not down, right? So if you're going to get more stimulus, that should be good for the stock market. It went the other way.
Well,
now,
maybe
it could
that,
be,
again,
of course, it's Chinese news, right?
The cross currents there with the China news, and let me restate it. The U.S. State Department says visa restrictions will now be slapped on Chinese government and Communist Party officials, quote, believed responsible for detention and abuse of the Muslim minorities in that country.
Right. Which is a gutsy news move by the Trump administration. There's been a lot of outrage about the way the Chinese have treated these people. They put them in labor camps, and a lot of these companies that they were going after have actually used surveillance against these communities, to put them in jail and in these camps. So I think it's a gutsy play ahead of the trade talks. It does put the trade talks at risk, but let's face it. I mean, Donald Trump does not do things quietly. He made the right move here. He's putting the spotlight back on human rights, which is where it should be, and I think it's a gutsy call. I think it's the right call.
I'd be remiss if I didn't remind our viewers that it was President Trump who wanted to ban immigrants from certain Muslim nations, so this might be perplexing for some of our viewers here, Alan Nuckman. Either way, it just appears that we are ramping up the tension once again, just as a very large contingent of trade representatives from China arrive here and begin to speak with Robert Lighthizer, our trade representative. That, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that the market couldn't hold gains it saw and interpreted from what Jay Powell said, two different subjects. But what are you seeing on the floor? What kind of trades?
Well, we saw the market open lower, and it's been hanging around these low levels essentially all day. But, I think we want to put in perspective, we're still coming into today only 3% from the all-time highs in our major markets. Now, there are a lot of crosswinds, like you had said, a lot of things to pay attention to. But first off, let's remember the Fed has a lot of tools to stimulate, and they're going to do what they need to do to get the results they want. They've done very well over the last decade, and I look for that to continue. Now, let's talk about what's out there. We've got earnings season starting. Then we've got Brexit here at the end of the month. We also have the possibility that the tariffs could ramp up here at the end of the month. So there are a lot of factors to flow through right now, but I still like the way that the market reacted last week, where it tested some 30-day lows and then bounced back. So let's see if it can continue. Like I said, I'm still optimistic, and yes, we're fighting through some of these battles, but I do love the resiliency of the overall market.
Indeed. Let's not overstate these losses today. It's a small fraction, under 1% at the moment. But Sarge, I do want to point out that this morning, people woke up here, again, with the trade talks restarting with the Chinese, and found that the U.S. government has blacklisted 8 different China tech companies, okay, 8 of them. That got the markets down about 300 points for the Dow Jones Industrials, and a lot of worry. In fact, I believe the semiconductors were terrible performers. I had noted at the moment that the semis just immediately tanked, and you know, because they have such a big exposure to China. They get a lot of their revenue from China, and so therefore it was a real problem here to see that. And then now we see this this restriction placed on some of the visas. And let's remember too, because the news flow is so quick, folks, that China, in response to the U.S. blacklisting 8 Chinese tech companies, had come out just a few hours later, again all of this today, saying, quote, "Stay tuned for retaliation." So, Sarge, it's like a tennis match, only the ball's on fire.
All right. This is what you do, folks. This is what I do, okay? I don't care if you copy me or not, but I'll tell you what I do. You decide if you want to copy me.
Okay.
All right? My bond allocation is twice as high as it has ever been in my life. All right, just so you know, I've reduced my equity portion to below 45%, which I have never been below 60%. So I'm not telling you the end of the world is coming. I'm telling you I'm building a fortress around wealth preservation right now. So I'm protecting myself. Most of my book is not most of my book, but my larger positions are all in dividend payers right now. Not necessarily the utilities and the REITs, but the ones that will say expose me to growth going forward. Stocks like you want to go with Seagate Technology, Western Digital, Cisco, Wells Fargo, CVS, Merck, Conagra, Pepsi, Telephone, and Verizon. All right, you have Sarge's picks right there.
All right, we'll take them. And Sarge, you have been saying for a couple of weeks now going to cash. Gentlemen, thank you, because we have a lot of abrupt moves in the markets right now due to differing headlines, cross currents, international, diplomatic, and of course, market-related Federal Reserve comments. With the closing bell ringing in exactly 30 minutes, we're sweating it out here, but we're right there with you. The Dow is down 163 points. And yes, while the Federal Reserve Chair and China trade war are sending shockwaves across Wall Street, China could already be ahead of the United States when it comes to one very important financial instrument of the future. With the digital China coin and the Federal Reserve falling way behind is really going to matter to our financial system. We take that up next with the CEO of Ripple. It's a Fox Business exclusive when the Claimant Countdown comes right back.
I chose to become an independent registered investment advisor because it gives me more freedom to act in the best interests of my clients. In other words, as a fiduciary, not just in the moment, but comprehensively and continuously. We are always thinking about you, the client. We are always responsible, always accountable, always looking out for you.
Charles Schwab is proud to support more independent financial advisors and their clients than anyone else. Visit findyourindependengadvisor.com.
My body is truly powerful.
I have the power to lower my blood sugar and A1C.
Because I can still make my own insulin. And Trulicity activates my body to release it, like it's supposed to. Trulicity is for people with type 2 diabetes. It's not insulin. I take it once a week. It starts acting in my body from the first dose.
Trulicity isn't for people with type 1 diabetes or diabetic ketoacidosis. Don't take Trulicity if you're allergic to it, you or your family have medullary thyroid cancer, or have multiple endocrine neoplasia syndrome type 2. Stop Trulicity and call your doctor right away if you have an allergic reaction, a lump or swelling in your neck, or severe stomach pain. Serious side effects may include pancreatitis. Taking Trulicity with a sulfonylurea or insulin increases low blood sugar risk. Side effects include nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, belly pain, and decreased appetite, which lead to dehydration and may worsen kidney problems.
I have it within me to lower my A1C.
Ask your doctor about Trulicity.
Does hair loss run in your family? Are you losing your hair?
You can now treat hair loss at home in just 6 minutes a day with a laser light therapy that's been clinically proven to treat hair loss and regrow thicker, healthier hair. It's called the Capillus Laser Cap.
Laser therapy is an FDA-cleared treatment for hair loss. What laser therapy does, it reboots that blood supply. It reestablishes blood flow, oxygenation. It's a very effective treatment for hair loss.
Using the cap is very simple. I sit pretty much right here, watch TV, and I have it on. It's completely comfortable. You forget you have it on.
I just put it on when I watch the TV, and I got my hair back.
I feel like it truly has changed the way I see myself and others see myself.
If you notice it, do something about it. Don't wait, because the longer you wait, the worse it can get.
Get the results you want or get your money back. Payment plans are available.
Call 1-888-675-7611.
Municipal bonds don't typically get the media coverage that the stock market does. In fact, some people may even find them boring. What they typically do offer is a stream of income that's federally tax-free. Municipal bonds from Hennion & Walsh can give you income that's tax-free, and you have to admit, tax-free income can be very exciting. At Hennion & Walsh, we offer you tax-free municipal bonds from across the country, so you can benefit from tax-free income wherever you live. There's nothing boring about that. If you have at least $10,000 to invest, we want to send you our exclusive bond guide for free. 1-800-763-2763. That's 1-800-763-2763. We're out to prove that tax-free income can be very exciting indeed. For your free bond guide, call now. 1-800-763-2763. 1-800-763-2763.
The People's Bank of China is close to releasing a national digital currency and a government-run network to go with it. According to the People's Bank of China, the so-called China coin will enable cross-border money movement, will increase investment flows to the country, and maybe even bypass trade sanctions. So where is the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government in the national crypto race? And what would it mean for the private cryptocurrency tokens here in the U.S.? Earlier today, I sat down with Brad Garlinghouse, CEO of digital payment network Ripple, whose XRP cryptocurrency is one of the most widely traded. Listen to what he said. How do you view the news that China has completed this prototype of a China coin that's yuan-backed and is about to unleash some type of digital network?
I think it should be a call to action for the U.S. So far, the U.S. I think has been very actively looking at this, but we haven't yet seen leadership. If you go back to the internet 25 years ago, the fact that the U.S. was a leader in the foundational technologies that make the internet what it is today has been fabulous for the United States from a GDP point of view, from a geopolitical point of view. These are new, profound technologies, and the U.S. needs to be a leader in this space, and we need to pay attention to the fact that China has really leaned in here.
Are we? Because if we look at our Federal Reserve Chief, Jay Powell, he has expressed skepticism about cryptocurrency. President Trump has expressed he doesn't much like the situation either, because perhaps they don't quite understand it or they feel that it's the Wild West. China and the People's Bank of China have harnessed this and are ready to put it out there. There is concern that this could put the U.S. dollar into jeopardy?
What I would say to President Trump and Chairman Powell is we shouldn't paint all crypto with one broad brush. What I think you see in their comments is the kind of very general view that can crypto be used for illicit purposes? Can crypto be used for anonymous transactions? The U.S. should not take a blind eye and not recognize that not all of this is about those illicit use cases. And the reason why I think China is leaning in is because they see that future.
But China says that they could use their China coin to surpass or do a workaround the sanctions that the U.S. has put into place on certain countries.
And so I think you're right that part of the opportunity they see is how can they dislodge the U.S. dollar. What Ripple is trying to do isn't at all to compete with the U.S. dollar, to compete with really any fiat currency. We're simply trying to use our technologies and use the open source technology of the XRP ledger to reduce the frictions in these payments.
Well, to that end, when you're talking about the government, French Hill, a Republican from Arkansas, and Bill Foster, the Democrat from Illinois, both wrote a letter to the Federal Reserve saying, you guys better get on the ball here. This is important because we could lose our status eventually, or at least put the greenback in jeopardy.
Right. And I think you are seeing some members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and luckily this is a very bipartisan issue, that they see that the U.S. has been a leader in many technical revolutions. There's no reason why we shouldn't be here. And there are big issues at stake, including, as we're describing here, kind of where does the U.S. dollar sit in the hierarchy of global currencies?
Well, are we behind if the People's Bank of China according to CoinDesk, has something like 50 patents filed for this kind of thing?
Yeah, I don't know yet if we're behind. I think there's a risk of falling behind. I mean, the good news is, I say in a self-congratulatory way, we do have some of the leading companies here based in the United States doing things around crypto. Ripple has been a leader in this space, and I think there's an opportunity to get behind some of these efforts domestically and really support them.
Which brings me to Facebook and the Libra project. Facebook is not just dipping its toe, but putting up billboards in essence saying, we're here, we're doing this. Granted, PayPal pulled out just last week, but you also have some skepticism around Libra. How do you see Libra and Facebook's efforts?
So I think on one hand, it's a very positive thing to see a major company like Facebook see that, hey, there are potential uses here for their consumers. I think right now, the Libra, it's a white paper. We haven't yet gotten to the point where it's actually a project that is going to be launched anytime soon. I think they've said sometime in the second half of 2020. I also think that the way that Facebook kind of engaged governments and engaged the regulatory community probably didn't set it up for optimal success.
I'm hearing you say this thing isn't going to happen for a long time, if at all.
I think that's right, and I think that's actually unfortunate. I think that had a different company other than Facebook taken the lead position and said, hey, here's a real opportunity, and Facebook joined, maybe we'd be in a different place.
But you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, that Facebook's reputation recently with the privacy breaches and things like that has really hurt its effort.
Well, at the core of any financial transaction, any financial currency, whether it's the US dollar or anything, it's about trust.
Boy, it's been a wild 2019 for crypto. Crypto came roaring back, many of these coins. XRP, in which you have a 55% stake, correct?
Yep.
XRP is the only, I guess, cryptocurrency that hasn't seen a year-to-date jump. I know you bristle when people talk about the value of it because you look at it differently, but why do you think that is? Why has XRP lagged?
I don't try to think about this on a 3-day, 3-week, or 3 months. I think over the long term. Look, I think it's lagged maybe because, in part, the U.S. government has provided clarity about Bitcoin, they've provided clarity about Ether, but then they've remained silent about the third most valued digital asset in XRP. I think regulators have a hard problem. These are new technologies, and I think there's work to be done there, and I think our track record shows that. And we're very transparent about what we do with the XRP we own. In fact, I think we've really tried to challenge the whole crypto community to be more transparent. Unfortunately, we don't know who owns the vast majority of Ether. We don't know, what different companies are doing. Ripple's trying to lead by example because we think the whole crypto community should be more transparent if we want this to be a major industry going forward.
We don't know if the so-called creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, even exists. Is it a man, a woman, a person? Have you met this person? Do you believe it's a human?
Maybe you're Satoshi Nakamoto.
I could be. I mean, is that just a concept that's made up?
Well, I think it's clear that that someone published a paper, or some group of people published a paper that was the Bitcoin white paper, and Satoshi Nakamoto is the moniker assigned to that. Is that a person? Is that a group of people? I don't know.
Nom de guerre.
Yes. Someone obviously knows, and there are various theories about what group of people. I happen to believe it's probably 2 or 3 people who represent what is Satoshi Nakamoto, and maybe one day we'll know the truth.
For its part, Bitcoin is down a couple of bucks here. It's at 8,173. We showed you Ripple. By the way, Ripple just released 1 billion XRP from its escrow wallet. Why? Well, Brad Garlinghouse answers that and so much more in the next part of my exclusive interview on the new and improved foxbusiness.com website. Go there and you will see the additional exclusive parts of that interview. Now, as Ripple and its fellow cryptos fight the fight for survival and growth, another mega-name disruptor looks to claw its way back into investors' good graces. With the closing bell ringing in 18 minutes and the Dow down 256. Up next, WeWork getting to work? Charlie breaks it on the major repairs being made to help the startup reclaim its former star status. And please download, listen, and rate my new podcast, Everyone Talks to Liz, available on all podcast platforms. The Claiming Countdown coming right back. Don't go away. It's a big market day.
I believe ETFs are a great way to invest in the market. I just don't believe in market cap-weighted ETFs. My research shows how fundamentals can lead to performance, and that's exactly how WisdomTree builds their ETFs. To me, it's a better way to invest. Legacy ETFs that track the market? That's yesterday. Modern alpha ETFs built for performance? That's WisdomTree.
Carefully consider the fund's objectives, risks, charges, and expenses before investing. Obtain a prospectus at wisdomtree.com. Read it carefully.
How do we make the future of energy ours? By knowing who we are, where we're going, by remembering the roads we've traveled, while developing new paths of our own. At American Electric Power, we're working to generate new ideas and empower possibilities for us all. Shaped by who we are, where we live, and what we value, the future is ours to hold.
Hey, no, I'm driving Dad to the hospital. He was just playing with Emma and he hit his head, but then he wouldn't stop bleeding and he got dizzy. Right, the blood thinner for AFib. How you doing, Dad?
I'll be okay.
Listen, we're pulling in. I'm gonna call you back.
This is the third time he's been admitted with a serious bleed. Is this blood thinner really helping him?
I understand your concern. Your father's atrial fibrillation increases his risk for stroke. This is why you're on warfarin. But there is an alternative.
Another pill?
No, it's called Watchman. Watchman is a permanent implant that reduces the risk of stroke.
In a clinical trial, 9 out of 10 people who received Watchman stopped taking warfarin in 45 days. There are risks associated with the Watchman implant, including internal bleeding, stroke, and in rare cases, it can be fatal. Talk to your cardiologist so that you thoroughly understand all the benefits and risks to see if Watchman is right for you.
Learn more at Watchman.com.
I knew about the tremors, but when I started seeing things, I didn't know what was happening, so I kept it in.
He started believing things that weren't true. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't say a word.
During the course of their disease, around 50% of people with Parkinson's may experience hallucinations or delusions. But now, doctors are prescribing Nuplazid, the only FDA-approved medicine proven to significantly reduce hallucinations and delusions related to Parkinson's.